The document noted here was discovered last week at a local estate sale in western Michigan. The journal belonged to a Stephen Merrill, age 70. Stephen was a scholar and head of psychological research for Great Lakes General. His most noted works came late in his career on both cognitive and perceptual disorders related to cerebrovascular incidents. The contents of this personal journal seem to highlight the start of his career as a research assistant fresh out of graduate school. Said journal specifically concentrates on an experiment into what most would consider obscure research for an acclaimed man of science. From what I can gather, Stephen met Dr. Anders in 1963 towards the end of his collegiate career. The 40-some-year-old Anders recognized Stephen's ambition and immediately earned his respect. An admirable quality, but the events that led to their collaboration were a direct result of Merrill's never-ending curiosity. Keep in mind that the two had already been acquainted for roughly a year by the time of the events recorded here. The undisclosed research project, titled solely as the static Specter experiment. October 12, 1964. Dr. Anders and I have completed another round of data collection for the higher-ups back at the university. It is enjoyable for me to finally be out in the field, and I know in time I'll get my chance to implement my own thoughts into making discoveries. For now, I'm happy just to be a part of something clinically relevant and to have my head out of a textbook. I feel bad for Anders, though, and the strife he has with the board is really starting to weigh on him. He smiles through the day and tells me that we will be doing something groundbreaking soon. I can tell his usually infectious grin is merely a facade. I've decided that I'm going to try to lighten the mood around here by picking his brain on something interesting. The guy's perspectives on everything are so unique. I'm not sure if all of them are plausible in practice, but it is refreshing to hear different views on established subjects. The guy can argue anything, though. I'll give him that. October 19th, 1964. This week was miserable, and our work was heavily scrutinized. By our work, I don't specifically mean my portion, though. Anders' portions of the research proposal have been heavily criticized. Apparently, he went rogue, implementing his own ideas into the paper. Some board members were down here this week to speak with him. I could hear the screaming matches from outside the room, despite the soundproof walls. To his credit, though, Anders somehow argued his way out of any repercussions. He was hired to think outside the box, and that's what he does best. The staff may even let him present his ideas at a conference soon. October 21st, 1964. I'm ecstatic. I'm finally getting my shot to collaborate on something novel. Anders has so many ideas on pattern recognition and evolutionary psychology that I can't keep up. So many exciting possibilities. He will speak next week to propose his ideas. He did give me a bit of a preface, though, which for lack of eloquence, I'll summarize in my own words. Although I don't have the entire picture, he told me to think about two things: that our brain seeks patterns, and that we have some drives programmed instinctually that may drive these patterns. For example, when walking through a crowded store or conference, you may overhear jumbled bits of sound from all the passers-by. The cacophony of sounds may be unintelligible for some time, but suddenly you pause, because you swear you heard your name. This is your brain trying to find meaning behind a stimulus that's not necessarily meant for you. Or even simpler, seeing objects in clouds, or that your car seems to have a face. And from an evolutionary perspective, think of being in your home late at night and you hear a creak. Chances are it's a floorboard or a leaking pipe, yet your heart skips a beat and your hair stands on end. Your better judgment tells you that there's nothing to worry about, so you go back to sleep. This scenario is a learned response over hundreds of generations. In earlier times, when a man heard a rustle in the woods, a decision had to be made. Do you investigate the sound? And are the possible consequences worth the risk? If during the excursion a branch broke free in the wind, the only real cost was the time and effort taken to walk into the woods. But what if the sound came from something more sinister? A wolf, a lion, a bear. In which case the consequence may be your life, Because of this, we still maintain this way of thought to a degree. Both interesting concepts, but I can't wait to hear what we will be working on to relate the two. I know that Anders is finally excited. I'm hopeful this is his big break. October 28th, 1964. The conference was a disaster. Anders was laughed out by his peers for his proposed investigations. Admittedly, with the information he proposed before, I did not see his prospective plan coming. He proposed what he called a scientific investigation into the afterlife. His colleagues simply called it a farce, a witch hunt, a poor excuse to promote the belief in ghosts. Humiliation aside, Anders' speech still maintained a degree of brilliance. I was sold on the idea, and still am. Anders gave his pitch the same way he gave it to me, but the follow-up was intriguing. He delved into a topic foreign to most of our colleagues: religion. Anders went on to describe dozens of cultures from around the world, separated by centuries of advancements, discoveries, and isolated by geographical borders. Despite seclusion between these cultures, though, nearly all of them had formed ideas on the afterlife, many of which shared a common theme of spirits beyond this realm. This is where the crowd murmured and rumbled, while others actively cheered for his removal from the podium. Before the underwhelming response became too great for the ambitious scientist to bear, he left with one final comment. "I believe those who are religious, spiritual, or those who just believe in the great beyond do so because of a connection, an instinct that has been with their line for thousands of years. Because such an instinct exists, their brains are more likely to make connections or derive patterns that may be viewed as signs of otherworldly beings. Perhaps they can truly confirm the existence of life after death." November 1st, 1964. Following the conference, Dr. Anders was promptly fired by the university. By the time I returned to work the following Monday, his effects were removed from our workstation. I was promoted to his position and given an immediate opportunity to excel. I felt guilty taking the position. I didn't want to seem ungrateful for the opportunity, but I also didn't want to gain the reputation as someone who betrayed their colleagues. And most importantly, Anders was a friend. I tried to reach out to him with the only number I had. There was no answer. December 6th, 1964. Research came to a standstill last week. Funding was pulled from our project. Our work was no longer deemed novel. A recent systematic review essentially rendered our findings outdated. Thankfully, I have a new job lined up. Dr. Anders finally contacted me 2 days ago. I tried my best to catch up with him, but he seemed too frantic to talk. Not in a negative way, though. The aging researcher sounded ecstatic at the prospect of his new work. He even said he found a workstation for his new experiment with his former employee, Huron Health. From what I understand from our previous conversations, Dr. Anders got his earliest start at Huron. Before attending college, he worked there as a mental health attendant. A nice way of saying he patrolled the halls to assist nurses in restraining and babysitting patients. Let's just say he had a few good stories to tell when the whiskey was flowing. December 10th, 1964. Anders and I met for the first time in 6 weeks. I was relieved that he harbored no ill will towards me due to the recent events that occurred. He simply handed me a flyer that he had posted downtown and walked me from the parking lot towards the old Huron Health building. I must admit, my concern has grown since that moment. The flyer read as, "Faithful believers, please join for a true scientific experiment to disprove atheism." The paper continued to list the contact details for Dr. Anders. Although the document was a bit unnerving and arguably unethical, what truly caught me off guard was the facility. It turns out that Huron Health was the base for his new research, but the corporation was no longer in business. He told me that the company recently had a number of failed ventures, and that new mental health facilities were the future. With his connections, though, he ascertained rights to utilize the facility before the lease ran out. The old mental health wing was archaic, to say the least. Anders' equipment was all set up at a former nursing station with a handful of monitors, which showcased a number of individual rooms. The rooms were refashioned cells which formerly housed patients. Each room was a barren aside from a table, chair, and a single radio. The paint was chipping along the walls, the hinges rusted, and cracks marred the floors. It was clear that the mental health facility was the first to face budget cuts in recent years. Despite the decrepit environment, I still maintained my faith in Dr. Anders. We would reconvene soon to discuss the details of the study. December 20th, 1964. I understand the logic behind the study, but it's still hard to comprehend. A true shot in the dark in the field of research. Uncharted territories that merge the beliefs of the faithful and applied by the standards of rational intellectuals. To keep the rigors of the already bizarre experiment to a minimum, the study was made relatively simple. Our sampled population would be adults in their 30s who held beliefs on the afterlife, and that those who had already passed could potentially manifest themselves in our world, meaning that they believed that signs could be left, or messages, or even the appearance of otherworldly apparitions. Utilizing the aforementioned principles, Dr. Anders believes that the phenomenon that our brains perceive as ghostly activity are a result of some spiritual instinct handed down in some people over time, that the unexplained sounds are actually stimuli that some can recognize, and not just our brain perceiving random noise as something significant. So, the doctor would provide each patient a secluded area of observation free from outside interference. The patient would be left in the room to listen to static provided by a single radio, and their events recorded. Dr. Anders hoped that if these people were more prone to recognizing a spectral event, then perhaps something could be documented with photographic evidence for the first time. Once and for all, proving the existence of something more beyond this world. I was skeptical, but I didn't see the harm from such a simple experience. January 10th, 1965. We have observed over a dozen patients in the first 3 days of trial. On day 1, we held each participant for 2 hours, and on day 2, each subject was observed for 4. Subjects on day 1 showed no clear signs of any sort of revelations, agitations, or experiences. One participant even began to nod off amidst the annoying static. The participants on day 2 showed similar results, although one was noted to have said they may have heard a voice in the static. No such phenomenon was recorded on our end. On the 3rd day, we decided to extend the trials up to 6 hours. Of course, the participants gave full consent, used the restroom, and were well nourished prior to the exercise. I'm ashamed to say I was particularly drained from trying to come up with background information for a proposal to be published. I dozed in front of the monitors on and off for roughly an hour. I eventually came to and winced at the monitors through tired eyes. The first of the subject was in roughly the same state as me at the time. He seemed to be slowly nodding, back and forth, lulled to sleep by the static of the radio. The second subject, however, was displaying more unique behavior. The 35-year-old woman was standing with her hand over her mouth, as if in shock. She pushed the chair back, leaning over the table towards the radio. After 25 minutes, the trial concluded. I opened the door slowly to her room with a subtle knock. The woman quickly turned her head with a look of confusion in my direction. I tried to ask her what she experienced, but her answers were completely unintelligible. She kept nodding and pointing to the radio while simultaneously covering her mouth. I motioned her to the door and she refused to leave. In a moment of panic, I decided to run to the other patient to thank him for his time. He wished me well in my endeavors and left without incident. As I guided him down the corridor to the exit, the lights began to flicker. I froze in the hall, paralyzed by apprehension. I had no idea how to handle the situation, and Anders wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour. Unlike Anders, I had no previous experience with agitated people. Despite her less than intimidating stature, I still felt threatened. I couldn't risk any harm to come to this subject if she had some type of mental break. I had to swallow my fear and act. A small endeavor of this nature couldn't risk any actions by an ethics committee. I reached the door, which had now been closed. This time I let myself in more forcefully and firmly asked the woman to leave. I was standing beside her, trying to decipher the look on her face in the flickering light. I decided to try and work past my fear and think as a rational researcher. The woman stood, staring at the radio, still in a daze, as I slowly approached. "Ma'am, please, tell me what you hear." I continued to push further despite the garbled responses. She began to grow manic at the sight of the radio, occasionally giving a hop in place, smiling widely, and forcibly running her hands through her hair. She let out a few giggles, and her head tilted forcibly to one side as her shoulders raised up and down with frantic, gasping breaths.
It was all a lie, you see? It was all a lie. It was all a lie. It was all a lie. You see? Can't you hear? Can't you hear their voices? No, you don't want to meet God. No, you don't want to meet God. You don't want to meet God.
The patient then let out a groan, clutching the sides of her head so hard that skin broke. Frantically, she writhed back and forth, smashing into the table and chair. My patience was low, and in annoyance, I reached for the radio dial. I was met with swift resistance as the participant punched me forcefully. I had never been struck in such a manner before. By the time I had processed the event, I noticed a figure looming into the doorway with the intermittent flashes of flickering light. I stepped back in horror as it quickly enveloped the woman. I stumbled onto my bottom and shuddered. "Stephen, a bit of help, please?" It was just Dr. Anders. He was performing a strong yet safe hold around the woman's upper extremities. I was relieved to see him arrive early. After finally turning off that damn radio, I came to Anders' aid and helped calm the participant without further incident. As it turned out, this participant was a major cause for concern. Despite showing possible reactions to the radio static, all evidence would have been completely refutable. For confidentiality reasons, I will simply refer to her as Carol. And Carol had a history of psychosis. During my lethargic monitoring of the patients, it seems that I missed a phone call from Dr. Anders, who had discovered that, while devoutly religious, Carol was bordering on zealous. She previously had committed multiple violent acts in the name of her Lord. Carol was actually an escapee from another facility just a week prior. Dr. Anders told me to go home and ice my jaw. He said that I had done well, and that he would take the next shifts until I could relax some. I told him about the incident, and he assured me that he could figure things out from the tapes. I went home that night with soreness in my face and a lurking sense of dread. January 13th, 1965. I'm not the most fearless person, and I let my emotions get the better of me. The difference between a strong clinician and a learned student is vast. I knew the way that Dr. Anders handled the situation was a level of skill that I needed to aspire to reach. When I got to the nursing station, I could see Dr. Anders staring intently at the monitors with a wide grin. I approached him slowly and began to speak when he quickly motioned for me to stay silent. Peering over his shoulder, I stared in disbelief at the monitors. First subject fell to their knees in tears with their hands thrown up to the sky. He muttered to himself completely incoherently. The participant let out a shrill cry before beginning to convulse. I quickly made my way around the counter towards the room when I felt my momentum shift backwards. "Anders, we have to help him, let go." Anders refused to let me go. He stated that it was part of his research, that he was finally getting results. And worst of all, he said, "I have to see if it happens to him like the others." My heart sank. Had other patients suffered a similar fate? Had Anders lost his mind? I struggled for a moment before my strength gave, and the more physical man won the altercation. He calmly offered me my spot beside the monitors. I looked in the room where the patient lay motionless. My attention was diverted to the second monitor shortly thereafter. A series of screams, no, laughter, permeated the halls. Anders, we have to get her out. How long's she been in there? We didn't wait long enough with the others. It's been 14 hours for him, 16 for her. We just need to wait a bit longer. It is coming. The laughter grew hysterical with every passing moment as she bounced off the walls with force. Finally, I covered my ears in pain as the static grew loud enough to echo throughout the halls. I fell to my knees, clutching my ears as tight as I could. I pulled myself up against the piercing sound to look back into the monitor. Then the screen went black, and the only thing that could be heard was her screams until silence. I pushed past Anders towards the door, and again I fell just short. Stay put. Document the evidence. I'm going to prove them all wrong today. I was completely petrified. Anders opened the door to the room, which no longer was illuminated by an overhead lamp. There was a brief moment of silence interrupted by deafening static. A crash could be heard against the door, and I scurried backwards. After my catatonic stupor concluded, I walked back to the nurse station to try to view the monitor. Still, there was only darkness. I dug through the stack of tapes and reconnected the monitors. I played back the tape from the 10th to watch Carol. When I dozed off, I missed something crucial, something indicative of the response Anders was looking for. A figure which appeared with the amplification of the static. I turned off the monitor and rushed back to the door against my better judgment. I had to get these people out of here. To my dismay, all three were dead. The man who suffered convulsions seemed to have collapsed due to stroke, most likely caused by stress. The woman in the adjacent room had multiple wounds to the head and face, assumably dying by traumatic force. Then there was Dr. Anders. His lifeless body was seated on the floor in the far corner of the room with his legs in a wide position. A ghastly grin marked his face, and blood poured from his eyes as he stared toward the radio, which now was positioned in front of him. I tried to turn away from the haunting display. His shattered lenses, the lifeless position, that haunting smile. I turned my back for only a moment to head towards the door. Just as my fingertips contacted the aging handle, a tingle ran down my spine. The radio had turned on, seemingly by itself. I pivoted instantly and froze. And amidst the static, I heard one final tone.
Will they believe me now?